Today, I thought I would talk about something that I'm trying to interest our government into paying more attention to with research that I hope they will fund. We'll see. But roughly, before we even get into the presentation, I'll give you the punchline. If there's one thing that I'd like you to think about after this presentation is how weapons that are designed to be very precise and scalpel-like in character so that they don't destroy things we don't want to harm, like innocent civilians, could nonetheless be used and prized to hit certain targets in such a way that they would do indiscriminate harm. Now, I don't know how likely this is. I think it's more likely than not. And the question is, even if others try to do it, should we? The notion of fighting fire with fire and an eye for an eye is very popular. But maybe the point of this presentation is to ask, is it a good idea? And you can tell by the tone of my voice, I don't think it is. But you're going to have to figure this out for yourselves. So I'll at least get the question in front of you. And that's the purpose of today's presentation. All right, why don't we begin? All right. Here are the questions we're going to try to tackle today. To what extent have theories in writing and predictions about missile wars and precision guidance have been realized? I'm going to focus on an author who is no longer alive, but he worked at the RAND Corporation. His name's James Digby. I really recommend anyone who's interested in this lecture to bother to read him. He isn't very long-winded and very thought-provoking. So what we're going to examine is, well, what did he predict about precision guidance in the 70s? And to what extent has that been realized? The second thing we're going to take a look at is what civilian targets might now be hit precisely and with what effects. I mean, it wasn't really anything he thought about, Mr. Digby, that you would use a precision missile to hit a civilian target. That was considered something you could avoid with these things. But in fact, there's reason to believe it may not go that way. And then the question, not only will they be targeted, should we target them? Which we have some control over what we do. We may not be able to control what other countries do or other parties, but we should wonder whether we should do it. All right, so let's go on and see what the brief answers are. This is, I call this the gentleman's C brief. At this point, you could try to memorize this and you get a passing grade. The answer to what predictions Mr. Digby and others in the 70s made about precision guidance that have been realized is that you can shoot something once and kill it. That was something that did not happen until precision guidance became popular. You're going to have a lot of shots in a war, an intense amount of ammunition or munitions are going to be laid down in a short period of time. The wars are going to be shorter. There should be less collateral damage, which is code for murdering or killing innocents that you didn't want to hit. But I would argue, I think these very missiles may also be used in the future to inflict harm against innocents in an indiscriminate way, something that he did not predict and no one predicted and is yet to be demonstrated. I want to make that clear. If I'm at all lucky, I could be wrong. I think I won't be, but I might be. Now, what kinds of civilian targets might be hit? I'm basing this on statements by various countries and parties. They are what I would call, as a general class, sympathetic targets, which is what a term from Russian military science. A sympathetic target is one that, when hit, explodes or has follow-on damage all of its own. You know, like dams. If you hit a dam, well, okay, there's an explosion, but then the water is released and it does even more damage than anything you did by exploding the dam. Petrochemical plants can kill people with poisonous gas. Nuclear reactors, we're going to get into that, actually take a deep dive into that, can now be hit in ways that couldn't produce massive harm, in ways that previous munitions that were very inaccurate actually couldn't. And that's non-intuitive, and I'll explain that. And then the question is, you know, it is, I think, likely that civilian targets will be struck in future wars, but I think it should be avoided if it occasions unnecessary killing of innocents. And it isn't just for military reasons, which there are plenty. I think it is for moral reasons. And I think we tend to cheat ourselves on the moral front. We tend to not take that very seriously. It may be pretty important, actually, for a government like our own, which is self-governed and therefore has to be self-disciplined and not give in to urges and excesses and things that are unnecessary. So that may be a big problem generally with long and highly destructive wars. It erodes some of the self-restraint needed to conduct oneself after the war at home. So there's a connection a little. All right, so let's get into this. All right, so let's learn what prompted the theorizing of the 70s about future wars and missiles that are precise. It really was prompted mostly by this event. And I remember being in, I hate to say it, college when this occurred. This was the bombing of the Than Hao Bridge. And this bridge in North Vietnam had been one that we had tried to bring down with 800 failed attempts, or what they call sorties, flights. And we never were able to hit the pylons. Someone figured out, well, if you put a designator, a little, like a pointer, a laser pointer, like you use sometime in these kinds of presentations, a little red dot, and you put it on where you would like to hit, and you devised communication between that laser beam and a guidance set, which you can see the bomb being dropped. It has fins in the front and the back. Those fins get articulated so it hones in on what you're pointing at. And when they did that, it only took, 8 bombers, with, 8 bombs at most, and they brought down the bridge. Well, that's pretty impressive. It's a 100-fold difference. And people wrote about this in the New York Times. This was a major event. Okay, what then followed? Next slide. Well, Mr. Digby, someone who I have the privilege to say I actually met and actually gained a fair amount from on a couple of projects, a very, very playful mind, nice guy. He wrote a paper on what the implications of precision guidance were. And it then was popularized, and not only he did it in a Rand paper on the left in late 74, but in 75, you can get this. It's an Adelphi paper, which is IISS. And he laid out a number of arguments about what we could expect the future of war to be. We are only now realizing most of those predictions and theories, not all of them yet, but most of them. Let's go and see what he said. Well, I think a good number of things were demonstrated by the use of precision-guided weapons. We have a famous invasion of Iraq, Desert Storm. We have Allied bombings after that in the 90s under the Clinton administration. We, part of the no-fly zone regimen that was put in place. There were wars in the Balkans in the 90s. There was an Operation Iraqi Freedom which we engaged in all kinds of bombings during that episode, which was, I believe, early 2000s. And then we had the Israeli destruction of a reactor at a place called Al-Kabar. Then Trump, Obama, and Putin used essentially cruise missiles like the Tomahawk, or in the case of the Russian, it was kind of like a Tomahawksky. But they used missiles against Syria. All of these things validated Digby's point that these things would be highly lethal in low numbers, that there'd be a way to limit the amount of indiscriminate harm, because you'd only destroy what you want to destroy, not other things, that there'd be high rates of fire if there was protracted war, and the pace of the war would be extremely quick. All of these things seem to be realized by our experience in the 90s. None of these attacks, however, were against states that had active missile defenses of their own or long-range precision weaponry to counterfire. So, it was kind of like trying to understand the importance of the machine gun when only one side had it. We thought the machine gun was terrific till we had to fight an enemy like the Germans in the First World War when they had it. So up until this period, it was a one-way battle, if you will. One side had them, the other side didn't. Let's go to the next slide. That changed recently. Here in September of 2019, you might well remember, or if you didn't, you can go back and find this on Google. There was an attack against a facility at Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia with cruise and ballistic missiles. And boy, was this a head turner. The reason it was a head turner is you'll notice the holes. They all were in identical locations. The Israeli intelligence analysts looking at this, they think that the miss distance was maybe 1 meter. That's pretty close to, zero, what they call CEP, which is circle of error probable. It's a kind of a term of art here. It's the circle that describes the radius, is defined by the radius of the aim point out to a circle that describes where half of the bombs closest to the target fall. It's kind of complicated, but let's just say a miss distance or a CEP of 1 meter is really very precise. That's sort of interesting. What's more interesting is these missiles managed to get around 3 layers of air and missile defense, Patriots, Skyguards, Shaheen. They were never engaged. This caused jaws to drop because NATO's air defenses aren't that different. And in fact, Undersecretary Rude of Defense told an audience of NATO officials that we had plenty to worry about. This was not just some kind of failure on the part of, some backward country, that Saudi Arabia's systems were as good as ours, and ours were no better. And heads up, we have a problem. The Israelis looked at this attack and started debating, maybe we need to have a dedicated offensive missile system, that our missile defenses, which are so good, won't be good enough to deal with this. That's pretty stunning. Let's go to the next page. Okay, if it was just a handful of countries or entities that had precise missiles, well, it'd be a worry. But what's interesting is the extent to which now an awful lot of countries, and even some non-state actors like the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon, have their hands on these things. This is different. This is a sort of manifest of all the countries that have missiles with 10 meter or less CEPs that can go quite a distance, whether they're cruise missiles that are air breathing or they're solid rockets. You'll notice the Some of these are South Korean missiles. Some of these are North Korean missiles. Some of these are Russian missiles. Some of these are Chinese missiles. Some of these are Israeli missiles. Some of these are Iranian missiles. Some of these are Taiwanese missiles. It's just going to spread further and further. This is not going to be contained by just those actors. Let's go to the next slide. Well, in addition, we have the advent of drones, things that go one way, although sometimes they come back and they're controlled. These things can be very precise as well. And you'll notice some of them are commercially available. You can get on Amazon a drone that can go 60 miles per hour and carry as much as a load of 20 pounds. If that was high explosive, that would be quite sporty, even if it wasn't 20 pounds, but even 10 pounds. That is, you can do a lot of harm. And we're seeing these things being deployed in places like Turkey with the terrorist organization PKK and everyone else. So it's coming as an issue. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so what he didn't consider is, well, would anyone ever want to use a precision missile to cause indiscriminate harm against not a military target, but a civilian target? Well, we got our answer this summer, and that was the Azerbaijanis in July had their defense spokesman say that the Armenians need to be careful. They have a reactor, there it is, and we have precise Israeli missiles, the LoRa, and we could use them to cause all kinds of havoc. This prompted a phone call by Putin, who has a keen interest in controlling events in that region, to our Erdogan, who was supplying all kinds of things to Azerbaijan. He pleaded with Erdogan to calm things down. This was a provocative statement that got a president of a nuclear country to call another president to try to ameliorate the damage here. In any case, just the uttering of these words with these capabilities prompted certain diplomatic efforts. Let's go to the next slide. But there's more. Recently, there was a news item that a purloined copy of China's targeting list was found, and it included Taiwan's reactors. Earlier, about 4 weeks ago, the mayor of Taipei said that Taiwan should target mainland reactors if the mainland continued to torment or threaten to invade Taiwan. And then earlier, several years ago, there was a study done in South Korea about how vulnerable their power plants might be to ballistic missile attacks by North Korea. And we know this because it was discussed in the parliament. So we have that. Next slide. Well, there's more. Hezbollah, which is a terrorist group in Lebanon, has been perfecting this Fatah 110. They're trying to develop even more precise guidance sets for the front ends of these things. And they have threatened repeatedly to hit the Israeli military reactor at Dimona. Similarly, the Houthis have large Scud-like missiles that they got from Iran called the Burkan 2H. And they have tried to, well, they've boasted, I don't know how realistic the boast is, that they have fired these things towards the UAE's reactor at Barakah, and that they intend to keep shooting at these reactors till they get there and they hit them. So, we have some reason to think that this might happen. This is not pure theory. This is at least speculation based on threats that have been made. Next slide. Well, what would you aim at? In the old days, when you had missed distances, let's say in the 1990s, early 90s, the missed distances were 1 to 3 kilometers. Kilometer is about how do we say this? About 6/10 of a mile is a kilometer, roughly. That's way of saying it. So you'd be lucky if you hit anything. Now, if you know you can get within 10 meters, you can aim at specific aspects or points or vulnerable aspects of the reactor. You could hit the power grid. You can see the power grid circled in red in the middle. And why is that important? Well, you need power going into the reactor to operate all the safety equipment. And that safety equipment consists of pumps that keep things cool. And if you lack power, then you have to immediately go on your diesel generator emergency set, which is down there to the lower left-hand corner. Thanks, Brooke. That's really that's good. And they kick in. Now, if you hit both of those things, then you're going to have a lack of circulation in the core and of the reactor. It'll overheat, and you're going to get a fuel failure and possibly another kind of Fukushima event, where it causes at least the power plant to shut down. Now, you could target also the control room, which tends to be outside of the containment of the core, which is why don't you show the cooling system area? That's the core. And it's protected with usually a concrete structure, a containment building. But the control room frequently is outside of it. You hit that, well, God only knows the reactor's out for sure, and you may get a coolant loss and a major accident. You could also, of course, hit the containment building. And there are munitions called tandem shaped charge munitions that can punch right through that concrete very effectively, because the concrete actually is not designed to prevent the penetration from the outside, but to keep things from leaving from the inside to the outside. So the pounds per square inch rating of that building is measured in scores of PSI, whereas to survive a munition that's shaped, I mean, you would need many hundreds of PSI and thickness that's just not there. Finally, there's a spent fuel pond. And this is usually a structure that's separate, and it contains lots of spent fuel. And if the spent fuel is in water, underwater, and if you hit it and you manage to drain that pond, you can get what's called a spent fuel fire. And we'll show you momentarily what the different effects are. Let's go to the next slide. My point in belaboring the different points is to say you can go from hurting no one to killing or forcing the evacuation of lots of people, depending on where you aim. For example, you could shoot an accurate missile into the parking lot and maybe just destroy one of the cars of the major operator of the reactor. Now, that wouldn't kill anybody, might, upset someone. And if you really had a merciful heart, you could say, well, we'll just do it in the parking lot without hitting any cars, okay? Nobody gets hurt, but immediately the plant gets shut down for fear that another's coming. Everyone in the neighborhood gets in their car and says, I want to get the heck out of here. And then all the roads get clogged. Not only that, but you probably would shut down if you had lots of reactors like South Korea does or Japan. You'd shut all of your reactors down, causing brownouts, possibly blackouts. And that's without killing anybody or even threatening to hurt anybody, really. If you wanted to do more damage, you would threaten to hit the power line going in, or the emergency generators, or both. I mean, if you did both, then you knew there was going to be a loss of coolant accident, probably. You could also hit the control room, the containment building, and it would cause the release of radioactivity. And then for extreme damage, you would have, hit the spent fuel ponds. Now let's see sort of what that looks like from a radiation standpoint. I did some studies, or had some studies done. If you hit let's see here, these are spent fuel ponds. You can see orange is an evacuation. Look at the areas that would have to be evacuated. It's pretty significant. We're talking about millions of people. In wartime, the idea that you would evacuate all those people, could be game over. In any case, that's from the spent fuel pond. Now, if you hit the reactor, those plumes are not as extensive. You can predict roughly what the prevailing winds are, so you kind of know, when to strike, if you will, and when not to. In any case, that's at the high end. There are many more of these charts, if you're an interest, that I can share with you on my website. Okay, let's go to the next slide. There are other sympathetic targets besides reactors: natural gas depots, petrochemical plants, dams, and explosive depots, as we saw in Lebanon not that long ago. Does anybody know what the predicted amount, what the estimated yield of that explosion was? If you have a picture, you get some idea of, how much, you measure the yield. What would the yield of that explosion be?
It's in kilotons, right?
Yes, I think that's right. They estimate 1/2 to 2.5 kilotons.
I was going to say 2.5.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a little hard to measure, but once you get above 500 tons, that's interesting. Or it's a big number. It's as big as, well, nuclear activity. Nuclear strikes. The nuclear weapons range from tens of tons, which I think are pretty unusual, to hundreds of tons, which is still pretty unusual and low, to 1, 2, and 10, 20, and 100 or 300 kilotons. So, it's in the range. This is not high explosive anymore. This is really big. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, now the question is, well, should we do this? I mean, they might. Shouldn't we? Shouldn't we threaten? Isn't that what deterrence is? Right? We like deterrence. We like using that word. Well, in the old days, we got into the habit of striking cities and leveling them. We did this as a matter of policy because early in the Second World War, we hoped to be able to hit things precisely, and it didn't work out well. Here is a train yard that was targeted in the beginning of the Second World War, and you'll notice all the pockmarks everywhere. And what they discovered after they did some studies of this and other raids is that the bombers were missing their targets by 5 miles. That the median miss distance was 5 miles, which means the circle of error probable, was like 75 square miles. Half of the bombs closest to the target only fell within 75 square miles of the target. Well, what do you do if that's the state of your technology and you're that imprecise? Go to the next slide. Also, people were shooting at these planes because they had to fly in daylight to get that level of precision. So they decided, well, we want to hold on to our bombers. Let's bomb at night so they won't be able to shoot at us so easily. And let's just aim for anything that's lit up, which is, of course, a city. And, these raids got very, very deadly. Operation Gomorrah, the firebombing of 40,000 killed plus 1 million homeless. The famous Dresden raids, which were really quite something. And these were not just aimed to harm the military production and communication centers. They had bombs that would rip off the roofs, then start fires to suck all the oxygen out of the air. So, if you were a human, you couldn't breathe because the fires would just consume all the oxygen. And if you ever came out of your basement, they had proximity fused munitions that would blow you up. So there was a really very conscious effort to kill people here. It wasn't simply, some kind of abstract run. And you'll notice that we did this in Japan as well. Firebombings killed, 100,000 in a raid. I mean, 16 square miles of burned to the ground. All right, so let's logically go where this leads. Next slide. Well, you'd want to get more and more yield to destroy more and more of the city that you were trying to bomb. And so everyone started moving up from the 500-pound bomb of the beginning of the Second World War. At the end of the war, they had a bomb that had that weighed 10 tons, but maybe it had, I think, half of that roughly was high explosive. And then, of course, the next slide. Oh, let's use a nuclear weapon. Very efficient. Just need one. Don't need a whole bomber raid of 1,000 bombers. And so it just seemed natural to do this. All right, let's go to the next slide. It also seemed natural to do this after the Second World War. We forget, but in the Korean War, we dropped bombs, more bombs on the North Koreans than in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. And we killed, 10 to 20% of the population. 1 million people or more were killed as a result of these raids. It helps explain why North Korea has tunnels for everything now, and everything's hidden in mountains so that we can't find it or bomb it. And you'll notice that the fission bombs were followed by what were called fusion bombs that worked with a different principle. And that principle is, they're called two-stage weapons, and they use fusion and give off much more of an explosion. You can see that the difference in destructive area of a hydrogen bomb of a certain yield, I'd say that's probably multi-megatons, versus the nominal bomb of Hiroshima. And in the mid-50s, we used these things to target Europe, Eastern Europe and Russia. And you'll notice that roughly the military objectives would depopulate all of Europe. Those dots are where we were going to bomb, and they're near cities or in cities. So we really got into this. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So you can say, hey, come on, what's the problem? We did this before. We had it as a policy. Why should we be squeamish about it now? Well, there also was another revolution that occurred, and it wasn't of ever increasing yields, but of ever increasing accuracy of bombing. It started actually in the First World War. There was this torpedo, they call it airborne torpedo, that was a radio guided device. It never was deployed, but it was the start of basically precision guided munitions. And then in 1944, they developed a TV guided bomb, which sort of worked. The resolution of the TV wasn't great, but it was an improvement over what we had. So we started there, and then let's go to the next slide. Well, in 41, the missed distance was about, as I said, 5 miles. Today, it's near 0. Quiet revolution took a long time, never was announced with an explosion, but it has implications. Next slide. Now, you can literally hit someone in the rear seat of a car that's moving, if you have the information, and not necessarily hit or kill the driver. This munition was not even explosive, it was kinetic. This was not possible 50 years ago or longer. This is now possible. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Well, this leaves 2 predictions or theories of Mr. Digby still out for bidding, if you will. He predicted that in a war, you would hit all known military targets, and you do this in a matter of days or weeks. Now, that seems correct because of our experience of going to war in the Balkans and the way we waged war in Iraq. But Digby went on and he said, once you get rid of all the known military point targets, you might want to bring the war to an end and you won't know what to do. What you might do is say, okay, to stop this war on terms favorable to me, I'm going to roll out my nuclear weapons and do something indiscriminate to get hostilities to stop. Or alternatively, he said, maybe there would be a pause because you ran out of munitions that were precise. You might pause and maybe negotiate. Well, it matters a lot as to, how the story ends. Is it the first one or the second one? Inquiring minds want to know. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. We don't know. And what's interesting is when you poll Americans about whether they're willing to bomb population in retaliation for, let's say, taking out an aircraft carrier. There was one recently in the Gulf. Well, what if the Iranians, destroyed it because they claim they have missiles that they want to use to destroy the aircraft carriers that we send in? Oh, well, when you poll Americans, 60% are willing to kill 2 million civilians in Tehran in retaliation with a nuclear weapon. So you're not going to find a ton of resistance from the American public to bombing indiscriminately, I guess, at least in this case. Let's go to the next slide. There's also polling with regard to North Korea. It's much the same. Now, the current theory of deterrence, which is very popular, I might add in this administration, is, well, what we'll do is we'll have deterrence by denial. And what that means is if, let's say in the case of China, but this is also true, I suspect, with regard to Russia, if the country in question has naval vessels, airplanes, missiles that leave their territorial air space or waters, well, we'll knock them out of the sky, or we'll knock out the base from which these things emanated near the coast, I guess. Or we'll go after the submersibles that are causing trouble with anti-submarine warfare. Okay, now that's a preference. It's pretty ambitious because you have to have an awful lot of things to shoot at an awful lot of things, and you have to be willing to do it early. And who knows how that works? But it's a great idea if you can make it work, I guess. Might cost a lot. Not clear we currently are able to do it very well. Food for thought, maybe we need a plan B for deterring. But okay, next slide. So what should we or will we target if we run out of military targets? Now, if you go after political control systems, those are surveillance cameras, you might not kill anyone. Or you could go after the leadership. Well, that was Hitler's bunker. Well, admittedly, it killed more than one, but not many more than one. Or you go after sympathetic targets, that's a reactor. You may be killing or making a lot of people very anxious in the thousands. Or, you could go after cities and kill millions. Next slide. I think we need to think about this. What non-military targets, if any, should be hit and why and how? Here are the listings, the same line I just gave. Would agreeing not to use nuclear weapons against cities make sense? Should we, only focus on objectives relating to political control, or do we want to take revenge? I mean, how's this work? Last slide. This is what we need. We need a renaissance in rethinking what's called counter value targeting, which is a term of art for things that aren't clearly point military targets. We need to think about this, and I don't think we are. I'm hoping you will. I'm done.